It's March 8, 1944. The morning sky was silver and cruel. Thin trails of vapor marked the paths of hundreds of aircraft clawing through the cold. At 25,000 feet, Luftwaffe pilot Oberleutnant Franz Keller spotted what he thought were easy prey. A formation of American bombers crawling toward Berlin, escorted by those same inferior fighters the Germans once mocked. The P-51 Mustang. He had laughed at it once. Its narrow wings, its American build, its unproven name. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 beneath him purred confidently as he rolled into position for the kill. The sky crackled with radio chatter. "Achtung! Mustangs ahead!" He grinned beneath his oxygen mask. The Mustangs were supposed to be slow, short-ranged, fragile. They were supposed to break off before the bombers even reached the target. But this time, they didn't. The silver shapes turned. Fast. Impossibly fast. Their engines howled with a sound no German had heard before. In seconds, the hunters became the hunted. Keller dove hard, but the American fighter clung to his tail, closing the gap with terrifying ease. For the first time, the Messerschmitt couldn't escape. That day, over the frozen fields of Germany, the legend of the P-51 Mustang was no longer a joke. It was fear. With wings, the Germans had laughed once. Now they were silent. In the winter of 1942, the war in the air hung in a delicate balance. Across the skies of Europe, the roar of engines never ceased. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, still held a grim dominance over the continent. Its aces, men like Adolf Galland, Günther Rall, and Erich Hartmann, ruled the thin blue line above occupied Europe. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were the spear points of German might, fast, agile, and deadly. On the other side of the Channel, the United States Army Air Forces were still learning what it meant to fight an air war across an ocean. Their doctrine, known as daylight precision bombing, was bold: to send unescorted bomber formations deep into enemy territory, trusting tight formations and defensive guns to ward off German fighters. At first, it seemed noble. Then it became disastrous. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, though powerful machines, were shredded by the Luftwaffe. Without proper escort fighters, entire bomber groups vanished in clouds of smoke and tracer fire. The raids over Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost hundreds of airmen their lives. By late 1943, losses were so catastrophic that some American commanders questioned if daylight bombing could continue at all. The Allies had fighters: the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Spitfire. But none could reach deep enough into Germany. The bombers were forced to fly beyond their protection, into the waiting claws of the Luftwaffe. The solution seemed simple: build a long-range escort fighter. But in 1942, that idea seemed almost impossible. The British doubted it could be done. American designers struggled to balance fuel range with speed and maneuverability. Every additional gallon of fuel added weight. Every mile of range meant loss of agility. Then, in the midst of this crisis, a new aircraft began to appear on test fields in Britain. Sleek, fast, and strangely American. It was designed not by an aviation giant, but by a relatively small company called North American Aviation. The plane was called the P-51 Mustang. At first, almost no one believed in it. When the prototype first flew in 1940, it was built for the British under a pre-war contract. The original Allison engine gave decent performance at low altitudes, but failed at high ones, where air combat in Europe was decided. The RAF used it reluctantly for ground attack roles, dismissing it as another good try from the Americans. But in those early days, buried beneath skepticism and technical limits, the Mustang hid its true potential. A design ahead of its time, Its laminar flow wing, aerodynamic shape, and internal fuel efficiency would later become the foundation for an evolution no one expected. Still, in 1942, that future seemed distant. The Luftwaffe dominated the sky, and the American bomber crews suffered night after night under the guns of the German fighters. For every formation that reached its target, another was torn apart before it even dropped its bombs. What the Americans needed was not just a plane. They needed a miracle with wings. And in the workshops of Britain, an unlikely collaboration was about to forge exactly that. By mid-1943, the Allied air war faced a grim paradox. The Americans had courage and industrial power, yet they were losing the air campaign that would decide the fate of Europe. The Luftwaffe was bloodied, but not broken. If the Allies could not wrest control of the skies, an invasion of France would remain a dream. The P-51 Mustang existed, but it wasn't yet the savior anyone hoped for. The Allison engine, fine for low-level runs, gasped for air above 15,000 feet. At bomber altitude, 25,000 and above, it was sluggish, outclassed by the German fighters it was supposed to challenge. The plane's elegant design was trapped by an engine that couldn't breathe where wars were truly fought. Then came the spark that changed everything. In the autumn of 1942, British engineers at Rolls-Royce saw potential that the Americans had overlooked. They believed that by fitting the Mustang with their own Merlin engine, the same power plant that had turned the Spitfire into a national icon, the aircraft could become something extraordinary. It was a marriage of transatlantic genius, American design, British power. In a small test field in Hucknall, England, the first P-51 with a Merlin engine took flight. The results stunned even the engineers. The plane climbed faster, flew higher, and reached speeds that put it nearly level with Germany's best. Its ceiling extended far beyond expectation, and its range, even without additional tanks, promised to carry it deep into enemy skies. When the first reports reached U.S. air commands, disbelief turned to cautious hope. By late 1943, the P-51B Mustang was entering service with the 8th Air Force. It was sleek, efficient, and deadly in the right hands. And crucially, it could go the distance, escorting bombers from England to Berlin and back again, something no Allied fighter had ever done before. The Germans, at first, hardly noticed. They were used to short-range escorts breaking off before the bombers crossed into their killing zones. When the first P-51s appeared over Western Germany, most Luftwaffe pilots assumed they were simply new versions of older planes. Many even joked that the Americans were desperate, trying new toys in their final attempt to hold the sky. They soon learned otherwise. The first major missions saw a shift in tone on Luftwaffe radios. Pilots began to report the same chilling detail. The escorts are staying with them all the way. The bombers that had once been easy prey were now guarded by fighters that refused to turn back. The P-51's combination of endurance and speed shattered the Luftwaffe's tactics. Their ambushes became duels, and duels turned into routs. The turning point had begun. The once-dismissed Mustang was becoming the weapon that would bleed the Luftwaffe dry. What had started as a joke in German ready rooms was now a ghost that followed them home. And as 1944 dawned, the sky itself seemed to change color. Silver trails of Mustangs stretching across Europe, escorting bombers to the heart of the Reich. The laughter of the German pilots was fading. In its place came something new: disbelief. By early 1944, the P-51 Mustang had become the weapon that rewrote the logic of air warfare. To understand why, one must look not only at its speed and beauty, but at the strategy behind it, and how this single aircraft changed the shape of the Allied air campaign. The tactical angle, redefining escort warfare before the Mustang. Bomber escorts were limited by the same problem that haunted every pilot over Europe: range. Fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt could only protect bombers for a portion of their journey, usually until they crossed the German frontier. Then they'd have to turn back, their fuel nearly gone. Beyond that point, the bombers were alone. The Luftwaffe exploited this mercilessly. They waited just beyond escort range, timing their attacks to strike when the American fighters had turned for home. B-17 crews called it the empty sky, a terrifying stretch where help simply vanished. The Mustang changed that overnight. With the addition of drop tanks, external fuel pods that could be jettisoned mid-flight, the P-51 could follow the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. This single change broke the Luftwaffe's most reliable tactic. No longer could they wait for the escorts to leave. Now, the hunters had company, and that company could outrun, outclimb, and outfight them. Suddenly, the sky belonged to the bombers again. When the Mustangs joined the 8th Air Force in full strength, bomber losses dropped dramatically. Missions that once cost dozens of planes began returning nearly intact. The psychological shift was just as powerful. American bomber crews, once braced for slaughter, began to believe in survival, and German pilots, once confident hunters, found themselves fighting for their lives in their own airspace. The technological angle. Aerodynamics meets genius. What made the Mustang truly remarkable wasn't just its range. It was how it achieved it. North American aviation's engineers had designed a wing that looked deceptively simple, but was revolutionary. The laminar flow wing. Most aircraft wings created drag as air turbulence built up across the surface. The Mustang's design smoothed that turbulence, letting air flow evenly and reducing resistance at high speeds. Combined with a sleek fuselage and internal fuel capacity, it created a machine that could fly faster and farther than anything in its class. Then came the Merlin engine, a CV masterpiece of British engineering that gave the Mustang lungs strong enough for the high, thin air of combat altitudes. The two-stage supercharger allowed it to maintain power above 25,000 feet, a region where the German Bf-109s began to struggle. Speed? The P-51 could reach 437 km/h, faster than nearly every fighter in the Luftwaffe. Range? Over 1,600 miles with drop tanks, an unheard-of number for a single-engine fighter. Climb rate? Over 3,000 feet per minute. Firepower? 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, with enough ammunition to tear through armor. But perhaps its greatest weapon was its balance. Power without recklessness, speed without instability, range without fragility. It was the perfect equilibrium of engineering and purpose. American pilots quickly realized that this wasn't just a new plane. It was a new kind of warfare. They could now escort bombers deep into Germany, engage enemy fighters, and still return home. Every flight they survived meant the Luftwaffe grew weaker. By the spring of 1944, the Mustang had become not just a fighter, it was a statement. The Allies had found their blade, and they were ready to carve open the skies of Europe. The Germans, meanwhile, were beginning to feel what they hadn't felt in years: pressure. The question was no longer whether the Mustang worked. It was how much longer the Luftwaffe could survive it. When the first squadrons of P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers into Germany, the American pilots instantly knew they were flying something special. Men who had fought in Thunderbolts or Lightnings spoke of the Mustang with near reverence. Captain Clarence Budd Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group later described it simply: it could do everything. Climb, dive, roll, turn. It made you feel like part of the airplane. The Mustang's controls were light and precise. Pilots said the plane whispered what it wanted to do. And if you listened, it would take you anywhere. The visibility from the bubble canopy, the stable gun platform, and the raw acceleration created an almost unfair advantage over enemy aircraft. For the first time, American fighter pilots felt they could fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms, or better. Their missions were long, grueling, and cold. Hours in a cramped cockpit, flying from England to central Germany and back. But the Mustang gave them confidence. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning. The camaraderie among these young men grew stronger with every sortie. Each kill was a victory not of arrogance, but of endurance. A small step toward ending the war. Yet even as they hunted German fighters, they respected their adversaries. They knew the skill it took to face death in a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. Beneath the rivalry, there was a grim, shared truth. Every man in the sky knew how easily one mistake could erase everything. The German angle, realization, and desperation for the Luftwaffe. The appearance of the Mustang was more than a tactical shift. It was a psychological earthquake. At first, the German pilots didn't believe what they were seeing. Reports came in from squadrons near Bremen and Hanover. The new American escort is faster than the 109. Climbs like a devil. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces, admitted in his memoirs that the arrival of the P-51 marked the beginning of the end for our control of the air. The Luftwaffe was still deadly, still brave, but its best men were being drained away in constant combat. Fuel shortages, lack of replacements, and the relentless American bombing campaign stretched them thin. And now, the bombers came guarded by Mustangs that refused to leave. Every German pilot who took off to intercept them knew what he faced. A fight against superior numbers, superior range, and superior technology. The laughter that had once filled Luftwaffe ready rooms, jokes about American toy planes and flying gas tanks, had vanished. In its place came quiet professionalism, tinged with exhaustion and dread. The veterans fought with skill, but their ranks thinned. The rookies barely survived their first missions, and every day the silver shapes appeared again, escorting the bombers like ghosts. The moral angle, the changing nature of air power before the Mustang, the air war had been brutal but limited by reach. Now, with long-range escorts, the Allies could take the fight directly to the heart of Germany, its cities, factories, and infrastructure. The moral burden grew heavier. Each bombing run that crippled a war industry also tore through civilian life below. For the first time, technology allowed nations to reach each other's core. The Mustang was a tool of liberation, but also of destruction. It symbolized how progress and devastation walked side by side in modern war. The same engine that carried freedom across Europe also carried death in its wake. And yet, to the pilots who flew it, the mission was never about cruelty. It was about survival, duty, and ending a war that had already consumed too many lives. By the spring of 1944, the Mustang had done more than win battles. It had changed the very rhythm of the war, turning Germany's once invincible air force into a desperate defense force. The tide was about to break completely. The turning point was near. It was February 20th, 1944. The gray winter skies over Germany were thick with the hum of engines. Hundreds of them. The 8th Air Force had launched Big Week, a massive bombing offensive against the Reich's aircraft industry. The plan was simple but audacious. Crush German aircraft production and destroy the Luftwaffe in the air, once and for all. At dawn, the bombers rose from English airfields, fortresses, and liberators by the hundreds, forming into vast lumbering formations. The sun caught their wings, and for a moment, the sky itself seemed armored. But what made this day different wasn't the bombers. It was what flew above and around them. The P-51 Mustangs. For the first time, the Americans had enough Mustangs to escort their bombers all the way to the target and back. No more turning back at the border. No more leaving the bombers exposed over Germany. The order was clear. Stay with them all the way in. The battle over Leipzig at 25,000 feet above Leipzig. German radar screens lit up. Controllers shouted to ready squadrons. Feindliche Verbände über Magdeburg. Hundreds! Within minutes, Bf 109s and FW 190s scrambled from airfields at Merseburg, Zerbst, and Altenburg. Their pilots were veterans, men who had fought since France and the Battle of Britain. They knew how to kill bombers, but this time, something was different. As they climbed, they spotted the shimmering silver swarm of American bombers stretching for miles. Normally, the Luftwaffe would dive through the formation, fire their cannons, and peel away before the short-range American escorts turned back. But today, as they lined up their attack, a glint caught their eyes. Coming out of the sun were the Mustangs, dozens of them, diving fast, sleek, and impossibly far from England. The German leader radioed in disbelief. Achtung! Begleitschutz! Sie sind immer noch hier! Fighter escort! They're still here! It wasn't possible, yet it was happening. The Mustangs didn't turn away. They came straight in, guns flashing, the sky turns. Read what followed was chaos. The American formation erupted in tracer fire as the Mustangs tore through the German fighters before they could even reach the bombers. In less than 10 minutes, entire Luftwaffe units were in flames. Captain Don Gentile and John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group led head-on passes against the 109s, cutting through the formations with the precision of a blade. German radio channels filled with panic, broken calls, desperate orders, silence. One German ace, Oberleutnant Hans Müller, barely made it back to base. His fuel lines were shredded, his canopy cracked, his plane covered in bullet holes. When he landed, he stepped out, trembling. He looked at his mechanic and muttered, "They came from England, and they chased us to our own fields." That sentence spread through the Luftwaffe like wildfire. The collapse of German air supremacy over the next 5 days, the battles continued, over Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Nuremberg. By February 25th, Big Week was over, but Germany's air defense system was broken. In 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost over 600 fighters and nearly 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Americans lost bombers too. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee control of its own skies. The Mustang had proven itself not just as an escort, but as the executioner of German air power. The turning point in the following weeks. American Mustangs roamed deeper and deeper into occupied Europe. They hunted the Luftwaffe in the air, on the ground, even in their own airfields. The laughter that once filled German hangars, mocking Allied aircraft as slow, heavy, or weak, was gone. Now, there was only silence and the dull echo of boots on hangar floors as pilots walked toward aircraft they knew might not return. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was afraid, not of defeat, but of extinction. By the spring of 1944, the balance of the air war had shifted irreversibly. What began as a desperate gamble during Big Week had evolved into a relentless aerial crusade. The P-51 Mustang was no longer just a fighter escort. It was the spearhead of Allied air supremacy. Each morning, from the airfields of East Anglia and the Midlands, long lines of silver Mustangs roared into the mist. Their Merlin engines sang the new anthem of the sky, a deep, confident hum that carried across England's countryside before vanishing into the clouds. Their mission? Hunt anything with a black cross. The fall of the Luftwaffe. Aces German pilots who had once dominated the air. Legends like Walter Nowotny, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Erich Hartmann now found themselves outnumbered, outclimbed, and outgunned. The Bf 109 and Fu 190 once symbols of German mastery, were suddenly prey. In engagements over Rhine, Bremen, and Munster, the Mustangs appeared without warning, diving from high altitudes where the German aircraft struggled to reach. Their speed and range made them ghosts, striking deep over Germany, then vanishing before ground control could react. Major George Preddy, one of the top Mustang aces, described it perfectly. "We owned the sky." The 109s were brave, but bravery doesn't outfly a Merlin engine. On June 20th, 1944, near Magdeburg, an entire Luftwaffe formation of 20 fighters was intercepted by a single squadron of P-51s. The Germans tried to brake and climb, but the Mustangs chased them relentlessly. Within minutes, 14 German aircraft burned across the countryside. When the smoke cleared, only 6 returned, and half of those never flew again. Escort to the end as the Allied armies prepared for D-Day. The Mustangs took on a new role: absolute air guardians. They escorted bombers attacking railways, bridges, and airfields across France and Germany, ensuring the Luftwaffe could no longer interfere with the invasion to come. From dawn to dusk, they circled like hawks over Normandy's beaches, ensuring that when the first Allied troops stormed ashore on June 6, 1944, the skies above were utterly, terrifyingly empty of German planes. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene. A handful of Fu-190s and Me-109s scrambled from northern France, but they were met instantly by Mustangs. Within minutes, they were shot down before even reaching the beaches. The myth of German air invincibility died that day. The daylight killers, through the summer of 1944, the Mustangs pushed deeper into Germany, turning airfields into graveyards. Low-level strafing runs destroyed parked aircraft, fuel depots, and transport convoys. American pilots called it the harvest. They strafed from dawn till dusk, their .850 caliber machine guns cutting through everything below. The black plumes of burning fuel stretched for miles. German civilians would later describe the new terror, not from bombers, but from the unseen fighters that came from the sky, striking like lightning and gone before sirens could sound. For the Luftwaffe, it was the slow death of an entire generation. The numbers tell the story. By September 1944, the results were undeniable. Over 5,000 German aircraft had been destroyed in the air and on the ground. The Luftwaffe had lost half its experienced pilots. P-51. Squadrons now escorted bombers to Berlin, Dresden, and Königsberg, missions once thought impossible. Even the mighty Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, arrived too late. Though faster than the Mustang, it was helpless on takeoff and landing, and the Mustangs waited for it there. At Lechfeld, Schongau, and Augsburg, they circled the runways like vultures. When the jets came in low on final approach, the Mustangs dove, turning technological marvels into twisted wrecks. The silence over Germany. By winter, the skies over Germany had changed forever. The once constant sound of Luftwaffe patrols, the howl of Daimler-Benz engines, and the echo of flak bursts was gone. Only the steady, rhythmic hum of Allied aircraft remained. For German civilians, it was the sound of inevitability, the voice of defeat carried by the Merlin's roar. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was now reduced to fragments, boys barely out of school flying outdated machines, facing veterans of hundreds of combat hours. They went up knowing they wouldn't return, and above them, the Mustangs flew in calm formation, their silver wings gleaming in the cold European sun. Symbols of a new kind of power, quiet and unstoppable. The Germans had laughed once at the P-51 Mustang. Now, it was the last thing many of them ever saw. By the end of 1944, the air above Europe told a silent story of defeat. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had darkened the skies over Poland, France, and Britain, was now a shadow, broken, outnumbered, and bleeding. Its aces were gone, its fuel gone, its confidence gone. And at the heart of this collapse was the P-51. P-51 Mustang, the long-range angel of destruction that rewrote the laws of air combat. Factories. Without protection for the German war machine, air superiority had once been its greatest shield. When the British bombed by night, the Luftwaffe struck back by day. But now, with Mustangs ranging deep into the Reich, there was no daylight safety anymore. Factories that once roared with production fell silent. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the synthetic oil refineries at Leuna and Mersburg, the aircraft assembly lines at Regensburg, all were reduced to smoking ruins. Oil was the true blood of the Luftwaffe, and the Mustangs drained it dry. By destroying Germany's fuel infrastructure, the Allies didn't just ground the planes. They strangled the war effort itself. Tanks couldn't move, trucks couldn't resupply, and training flights were cancelled for lack of aviation fuel. In some bases, pilots were ordered to taxi once a week just to keep engines from seizing. But they never took off. By December 1944, Hitler's Reich had fewer than 300 operational fighter aircraft left across the entire Western Front. Hitler's desperation, the jet, gamble, desperation led to madness. Adolf Hitler, convinced that a miracle weapon could save the war, pinned his hopes on the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first jet fighter. It was fast, nearly 100 mph faster than the P-51. But production was too slow, resources too scarce, and pilots too inexperienced. Hitler's interference only made it worse. He demanded the jet be used as a fighter-bomber, delaying its deployment as a pure interceptor. By the time Me-262s appeared in real numbers in early 1945, it was too late. Mustang pilots quickly learned their weakness. They were vulnerable during takeoff and landing, so they waited above German airfields, diving like hawks the moment a jet tried to land. One American ace recalled, "It was like watching the future die before it could take off." The Mustangs above the Ardennes. Then came December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble on the Western Front. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had left into the sky to cover the offensive, including thousands of untested young pilots, flying obsolete aircraft. On January 1, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe launched a surprise low-level strike on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. It was meant to cripple Allied air power in one decisive blow. Instead, it became a massacre. The Mustangs scrambled fast, intercepting returning German aircraft before they reached their bases. In just one day, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 300 fighters and 200 pilots. It never recovered. The road to Berlin. The Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945. The Mustangs ranged farther still, strafing trains, convoys, and bridges, cutting every line of escape. They weren't just protecting bombers anymore. They were erasing the Luftwaffe's ability to exist. Photographs from that time show endless lines of wrecked German planes along highways and airstrips, their wings twisted, fuselages burned black. By April, Luftwaffe headquarters could no longer issue orders effectively. Communications were gone, airfields captured, and pilots too exhausted or terrified to fly. American P-51s circled unchallenged over the ruins of Berlin. Their shadows crossed the city where the war had begun, a quiet reminder that dominance in the air had decided the fate on the ground. The Reich was collapsing, and the Mustang was its herald. The human cost-even victory had its weight. Many American pilots, now seasoned aces, spoke later of how the thrill of combat had faded into quiet sorrow. They saw the faces of their enemies, boys barely 18, climbing into burning machines, forced to die for a lost cause. Clue. James Goodson, who flew Mustangs over Germany, once said, "We came to destroy the Luftwaffe," and we did. But when the smoke cleared, there was no joy left in it. The Mustang had become both a sword and a mirror, showing what humanity could achieve and what it could destroy. By May 1945, the air war was over. Germany had no fighters left to rise against the endless formations of Allied aircraft. When Berlin fell, it was under skies ruled entirely by American wings. And high above the ruins, the Mustangs flew one last patrol, not to fight, but to witness the end of the war they had helped win. When the guns finally fell silent over Europe in May 1945, the men who climbed out of their P-51 Mustangs stood among the wreckage of an air war they had utterly transformed. The Luftwaffe was gone. The jet age had dawned. Yet, for all the technology and triumph, the P-51 left something deeper behind, a new understanding of what air power truly meant. From weapon to symbol as victory, parades rolled through London and Paris. The Mustangs that had once been instruments of destruction became symbols of liberation. Crowds looked up as their silver wings shimmered over ruined cities, elegant, almost peaceful, as if the sky itself had been restored. To many Europeans, the Mustang was more than an aircraft. It was the sound of freedom returning, the deep, steady pulse of the Merlin engine echoing above streets that had once trembled under Luftwaffe bombs. Children waved at the passing formations. Old men who had survived the Blitz watched in silence, knowing that the tide of war had been turned by those who mastered the air. For the pilots, the Mustang wasn't just a machine. It was a brother, one that had carried them across the Channel, across fear, and into history. The evolution of air power before the Mustang. Fighters were seen as tactical weapons designed for short-range dogfights, limited by fuel and geography. After the Mustang, everything changed. The lesson was clear. Control of the air required range, speed, and reliability. It wasn't enough to defend. The winner would always be the one who could reach the enemy, escort his bombers, and strike before being struck. The Mustang's success shaped every post-war design philosophy. Aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, MiG-15, and even the early F-100 Super Sabre carried its DNA. Sleek fuselages, laminar flow wings, and the balance of endurance with aggression. Generals studying the air campaigns of Europe concluded that the war had not been won by numbers alone, but by mobility and reach. And that reach had been defined by the P-51, a world divided. A sky still ruled when the Cold War began. The world changed again. But the Mustang was not finished. Hundreds were transferred to newly rebuilt European air forces, to South America, and to Asia. By 1950, as the Korean War erupted, the P-51 once more found itself in combat, strafing ground targets and escorting bombers in the rugged skies of the Korean peninsula. Jet aircraft soon replaced it, but even the earliest American jet pilots admitted something rare. If I had to go low and come home alive, I'd still take the Mustang. That respect endured, a quiet testament to the perfection of its balance between power, grace, and will. Germany's silence, America's sky, in the ruins of post-war Germany. The airfields that had once launched Messerschmitts became graveyards. The survivors of the Luftwaffe looked back with disbelief at how swiftly the tide had turned. They spoke often of that moment, when the Mustang appeared above their homeland for the first time, not just as a fighter, but as a messenger that the war and their dominion of the sky was ending. For many, the sound of the Merlin engine became a ghost that lingered for years. It haunted veterans who remembered looking back over their shoulder and seeing that polished nose, closing in with impossible speed. The end of an era, the birth of an ideal by 1949. The last operational Mustangs in the U.S. Air Force were being retired from frontline service, replaced by jet fighters. But unlike most weapons of war, the Mustang's story did not fade into obsolescence. It became a legend, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it proved. That courage, engineering, and vision could change the course of a world war. That dominance in the air could save lives on the ground. That sometimes the simplest design, born from desperation, could redefine history itself and echo through time today. When a restored P-51 Mustang takes to the air at an air show, its roar still carries the memory of 1944. Crowds fall silent as it climbs, a sound older than jets, more human than missiles, a sound that once turned the laughter of German pilots into fear, and fear into silence. The Mustang doesn't need to prove itself anymore. It already did, in the thin, frozen air over Germany, when it outran the Messerschmitts and changed the sky forever. History remembers machines, but it never forgets the hands that built them, or the hearts that flew them. The P-51 Mustang was born not from luxury or power, but from necessity, a desperate answer to a question no one wanted to ask. How do you win a war fought in the air, across oceans and nations, when your pilots can't even reach the enemy? The answer came in aluminum and courage, in the whine of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and the steady hand of a young man barely 20, in the balance of science and instinct, of design and destiny. The Mustang became more than a fighter. It was an idea that freedom could fly faster than fear, that ingenuity could overcome tyranny, that the sky, once a weapon of terror, could again become a place of hope. Every time its shadow crossed the clouds over Europe, it carried not just bullets or bombs, but belief that light could return to a continent darkened by war. When the laughter of German pilots faded, it wasn't because they feared a plane. It was because they understood that something greater had arrived, something beyond speed and range. The Mustang was not merely better built, it was better imagined, and in that imagination, humanity caught a glimpse of what it could become. Creators instead of destroyers, dreamers instead of conquerors. Decades have passed, but even now, the echo of its engine stirs something deeper than nostalgia. It reminds us that every era has its wings, and that progress, when guided by purpose, can lift us above the ruins we once created. The P-51 Mustang was the sky's most beautiful answer to the madness of war. And long after the last pilot has landed, its spirit still flies. Not as a weapon, but as a whisper across time, saying quietly to all who look upward, "We once learned to master the wind. Let us now learn to master ourselves,